We're going to continue with Dr. Hans Holzer. Let me just give you a short introduction. Dr. Holzer, as you very well known, he's extremely well known internationally for his prolific publications. Dr. Holzer has been doing haunting investigations and investigations of other phenomena for many years. He has taught parapsychology at the New York Institute of Technology and has lectured and still lectures extensively. Dr. Holzer has discussed his work in many TV programs, but in addition, he has written and produced television and feature films. So he's very talented in writing for films. He holds a PhD from the London College of Applied Sciences and is the author of over 100 books. Some of the titles that we have at the Parapsychology Foundation Library, and it was hard for me to select because when I called the catalog, there were so many titles that I really had to do almost a random selection. But some of them are Ghost Hunter, published in 1963, and that was followed by books such as The Lively Ghosts of Ireland, Best True Ghost Stories, Ghost, which I think you have out there, and Ghosts of New England. I have mentioned mainly his books on ghosts and hauntings, but he of course has published in other areas of parapsychology such as telepathy, healing, and many other areas. Dr. Holzer will be speaking from the table. He is recovering from recent surgery, and he has asked to remain seated. And I'm happy to introduce Dr. Hans Holzer to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, hauntings, ghosts, is what made me well known. But I have done other areas in parapsychology. I'm very much involved in reincarnation research. I'm involved in all aspects of parapsychology. But once you get these titles, it happened in Pittsburgh. I was doing promotion for a book, one of my first books, in fact. The book was called Ghost Hunter. And the host said, "There he goes, the ghost hunter himself." And I've never been able to get rid of that thing. I feel embarrassed. I am a professor of parapsychology. I taught for 8 years at New York Tech, and but that's the way it is. The last 5 years have been very important in my life because in science, too many conservative scientists come to a conclusion and then they stick with it. The truth is, science is a developing search for truth, not the truth itself. In fact, scientia means search for truth. Well, as I went along, having written all those books on ghosts and haunted houses and their incarnation too, something became obvious to me. There was a system, a very orderly system. It was, and one fine day, I was walking on the beach in France, in California, with Jim Pike, Bishop Pike, a close friend of mine. And he had written a book about how his son had contacted him from the other side. And I said, "What am I going to call this book?" I said, "Why don't you call it The Other Side?" And that's how those terms were invented. So, yeah, the other side is a great idea. The other side of this, the other side of that. And that's how the term The Other Side was born. Since in those last 5 years, I noticed something that was definitely different from what I had been preaching all those 25, 30 years. I had been talking about hauntings and ghosts as something, like some exception from the norm, and a phenomenon that had some validity on its own, and that needed to be explored as a phenomenon. And it gradually became clear to me that hauntings and ghosts are inseparable from the understanding what we are, what is man, what is our, how do we function. And I started collecting case histories, including my own, and created a manuscript which hasn't been published yet. It is called The Spirit Connection, How the Other Side Intervenes in Our Lives. Now, many orthodox parapsychologists don't like to hear about the word spirit. They don't like to hear from mediums. They like to prove everything comes from us, from our special ability called ESP, and that's all it is. Well, it's not. It's not at all. ESP, the ability, the psychic ability, makes it possible, makes it easier for the things to occur that occur when there is intervention from the other side. Now, the other side I know exists. This is not belief. This is not faith. I am as far removed from any kind of religion or cult or religious conviction as you can be. I am interested in evidence, hard evidence. And so for the last few years, I worked with trance mediums like Philip Solomon in England and many others. In fact, I go back. I have worked with Eileen Garrett, one of our greatest mediums of all times. And she too had a hard time convincing the Orthodox fraternity about her guides, her controls. And yet there they were. Well, it became clear to me that the other side is a very real world, that it is as similar to our world as can be, that it is a bureaucracy just like ours, and that when we pass out of our body, that we go on into the next stage of existence. Now, one of the problems, to get back to hauntings and ghosts, is that, and Eileen Garrett pointed this out to me years ago. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah. Pointed it out to me that a great many apparitions are nothing more than imprints, psychic imprints in the atmosphere of an event that had emotional connotations. A large section of so-called sightings are not real people. They are photographs of real people that got stuck in the atmosphere. And how can you tell the difference? Again, Eileen showed it to me and I experienced it in myself. If a certain event occurs precisely in the same way, at the same time, in the same place, more than once, it is likely to be a replay from the past. It has no life. Even some great psychics can't tell the difference. I was in Winchester, England, Winchester Cathedral, and because someone had taken a psychic photograph there, and I wanted to follow up, and it was a rainy day, which is important, the atmosphere, the humidity, and I took a series of photographs, and on the photographs, and Sybil Leek was the medium that was providing the juice, so to speak. And on the photograph there appeared a group of monks, cowled monks, which makes sense because Henry VIII treated them rather mean, and many were killed at that time at the dissolution of the monasteries. And the question was I photographing the monks still walking, or was I photographing the monks in the past? And I noticed that the monks were walking below the present level of the church. These were memory monks and not ghosts. And I have to tell you that a very large portion of ghostly sightings is like that. However, if there is a differentiation, if different times, different variations, then we have real people to deal with. And now this brings me back again to what are we? I have come to the conclusion after many sessions with trance mediums whose work I knew and respected, that there is, of course, no heaven and no hell. Religion has been one of the most misleading and misguided forms of information when we are trying to deal with what we are and what the nature of the universe is, what Earth, and then that beyond this. But it seems from taking all this information together and running it through my mental computer, I found the following. Number one, we are born with a double body. Our physical body on the outside has an exact duplicate in the inside, called the etheric body, or you wish to call it the soul, or you wish to call it the aura. It's the same thing. And this double body is precisely the same as our physical body, with one exception. It is in a dimension in which time, as we know it, does not exist. Everything else is the same. Feelings, knowledge, abilities, everything stays the same. Now, when the moment comes of the dissolution of the physical body, you slip out of it and are already in your next body, which is the etheric body, in which you are what you just were before. You are neither better nor worse. You're not an angel or a devil. You're just another person like before, who now inhabits another body, by the way, which is also physical, but of a finer substance, moving at a higher rate of speed than the physical body that we know. And so that's why when at death, we don't go up or down, we just go out. And when we go out, we are now in the so-called other side of life. The other side of life consists of 7 levels. And again, this is the consensus of all the testimonies through deep trance mediums from many sides. There is the first level, rather dark. Apparently that's where people arrive who have not been enlightened, let's put it mildly. The so-called evil, well, if you wish, the absence of good is evil. The people who go to land on that first level are what in the church history would be hell, of course, or purgatory, which does not exist. The second level is where everybody else goes. The third level is where you rise when you have begun to do some work with people here, because nobody goes off on the other side. Everybody gets jobs, everybody connects with somebody here, everybody's assigned a task according to their ability, according to who they are or where. And I should say are, because we are always alive. We never die. And now, second level is everybody. Third level is people who are potential teachers, potential leaders, and they are already being instructed by some of the so-called guides on the other side. They're not angels, they're guides. And on the fourth level, they form groups of people who work together. And for various purposes, people who have been doctors become medical groups, people who have been whatever else. They form groups to work together. In each case, their purpose is to connect with the physical world and to serve the physical world the way they're able to. Nobody sits around and plays the harp and grows wings on the back. That's the invention of the religious denominations. Because remember, religion is there to keep the faithful in line, one way or the other, by fairy tales or by threats. Now, that's the fourth level. On the fifth level, we find people who have already been trained to be leaders. Now, if they don't want to stay, they have a choice to go back. They can apply for reincarnation immediately. And in the words of one of the mediums I have worked with, they have to register with the clerk. Those are the terms. And the clerk will say, well, okay, when the right couple comes along, I'll let you know. Get online. And they do. And when the time comes that he's found a couple for them, they will walk to a water, or something called, they all call the same thing, the well of forgetfulness, where they wipe out who they were before. They don't always do a good job because people have bits and parts of memories, and in recurrent dreams they remember who they were, and then they come to me for hypnotic regression, and we try to find out who they really were and prove it. Evidence, not belief. Belief, disbelief. Those are all bad words. Supernatural, bad words. Evidence, hard facts. And now the other ones who are now on higher levels, sometimes they have to go to school to be re-educated. But once they reach the fifth level, those are the future avatars, the future guides, the future leaders. The sixth level is where the government sits. Now, what is this government? I called it that. They, my friend Philip Solomon, who is a very good deep trance medium, said, "You are angels, aren't you?" And the leader of this group says, "We are not. We don't call ourselves angels. We are called beings of light. That's all we are, beings of light." And there's 9 of us. There used to be 10. One is gone. There's just 9 of us. And so my friend in deep trance asked, "What is your name?" And he said, "Michael." And that is the government. And then, of course, came the question, what is on the 7th level? And he said, all we can see is an enormous light. Not an old man on a throne, not anything physical. We see an enormous light. And if that is God, so be it. Now that's the structure of the other side. And they intervene in our lives, either because they think somebody needs help, or because we ask for help. We ask for help if we have failed to help ourselves. That is the condition. If we have led a positive life and we have a problem and we have failed to resolve it, then we will say, friends, if you wish. If you wish to say God, say God. I have a problem. It is such and such and such. I have tried to resolve it and I have failed. Intervention, please. And you know something? They will intervene in a way that is not defying logic. They will use ways and means to make it appear natural, but it isn't. It is done because it has been decided on the other side by the guides that you ought to be helped, and you're being helped. And that's the system. That is the whole system. There is no, in all these investigations, not even once did I hear of any saints, not even once did I hear of any religious figure. But I heard of people like us who had passed on and remained their personalities and were living in a very real world. Now that world is three-dimensional to them. It is only when they come and visit here they become two-dimensional to us. Psychics can read the future if they are allowed to by sticking their head out of the three-dimensional physical into their world temporarily and reporting back what they see. This world that is coexistence spatially with our world is a bureaucracy just like our world is, and a well-organized one. And it is what I found in years and years of work with deep trance medium and testimonies, that which I have been saying for so long was really incorrect. Now I'm coming to ghosts and hauntings. Ghosts and hauntings, when it's not an imprint but a real person who is not gone from this side to the other side because of emotional turmoil, because they're stuck between the two worlds. They're stuck because of emotional hang-ups that have not been resolved, and they don't know where to go. All of us are spirits, but when something goes wrong, the normal transition after physical death is prevented, and they are stuck in a physical world, yet being no longer of it, and they cannot help themselves unless somebody comes along and explains to them what they are, what has happened to them. Ghosts never know that they are ghosts. Spirits, all of us, we just pass over to the next level, whatever it is. But the ghost is out of this world and nowhere. They're in, well, purgatory. The only way they can move on, and I have done thousands of these contacts, is when you make contact with an unfortunate one like that, they will say first, where am I? Or, when you tell them gently, you've passed over. Oh, no, I've been ill. And then eventually you have to be like a psychiatrist. He says, no, you have passed on, but you're alive in another dimension right next door. That's what Eileen Garrett called it, by the way, the world next door. And then what do I do now? Panic. Well, you have to reach out to your loved ones. Just call out to your loved ones by name and say, please help me across. And they will. And they are gone. That's all there is to it. That's all there is to it. It's a picture quite different from what you may have heard before from me and from others. But I have to be honest, these few years, past years, 5, 6, 7 years, the evidence was so hard, the intervention was so incredible. When I asked for intervention, I got it. When there was need for it and when I deserved it. And I realized I was dealing with a government, a system that was extremely well organized. And it had nothing to do with religion. Nothing. And the other side is simply the other half of ourselves. We are born with a physical body and a etheric body inside it, and at death we shed the outer body and live on in the other body, just like you were. Nothing is different except time as we know it. Are there any questions about this?
I want to know if we have some kind of destiny.
Yeah. Depending on our abilities, the way our life shapes, we will be assigned a position of connecting with people here. It's a kind of a employment charge. Karma, in the Indian sense, is a religion. Karma becomes religious connotation. Do we have a purpose? Yes. But if something happens to us, or we do something, it is not because of a overall destiny, but because the board of directors on the other side has looked at our chart and has said, well, this person could do this and doing that, do it in that area, or help those people. Let us see that he does this. It is a case-to-case decision, not a destiny as such. I don't find that there is an overall destiny. But there is, of course, in reincarnation, from one incarnation to the other, if something goes wrong in one incarnation, then the next one will have to deal with it to balance the books. In that sense, yes. But that depends on what we do in one lifetime. We make our own destiny. We make our destiny. We have free will to make decisions based on the situations we are confronted. But depending on what decisions we make in one lifetime, it will affect our next lifetime. Yes. Yes. Come on over so I can hear you.
Could you speak a little about the Amityville case? Did you ever personally witness any of the alleged phenomena?
Okay. Amityville is not a haunted house. Amityville is a very good promotion. I wrote 3 books about it. I want to know. Amityville was built on a Indian burial ground, and Indian burial grounds are sacred to the Indians. Around 1905, heavy rain exposed a skeleton of an Indian chief on horseback, and a child came along and broke off the skull and played with it. And that's when the fun started. The Indian chief, quite rightfully, went on the warpath and decided no one should live on that land. So from that moment on, there were nothing but difficulties. And people in the house, this was an old house, built in 1782, divorced, unhealthy, unhappy. Eventually, everybody moved out, and the house was moved to another spot where it still stands perfectly fine. Another house was built, and despite the warnings, you don't build houses on Indian cemeteries. Family moved in that had a son who was volatile, let's put it this way. He was not crazy or anything like that, but he was a natural medium. He was easy to take over. And the Indian chief took over. I have some pictures taken during one of the visits showing clearly how the Indian chief superimposes himself over me while I'm interrogating the medium. In trance, she is in trance. And the young son became possessed by the chief in order to accomplish what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do is kill everybody. So this young fellow, Ronnie DeFeo, went around from room to room with a rifle, killed all members of his family. Nobody heard anything. Nobody got up. The sound did not travel because this was a psychically active field. It prevented the sound from travel. And of course, the court would not believe it, but young DeFeo doesn't remember killing his people. Purely a case of possession. It is not a case of hauntings. The Amityville house is still there. Somebody lives in it, and I wish him well.
What's interesting, the part about the child playing with the bones of the Indian, it sounds very similar to the Bell Witch case. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
The child playing with a skull?
Yeah, you should not. The Indians are very, very strange people. They have a very powerful religion, and they take the cemeteries very carefully, very, very seriously, and so they should. The house is still there. The people in it don't believe in anything, and I think that one of these days there'll be a fire. Oh, well, that's the way it is.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Please come here.
Could you describe how these interventions work with when you talk about like with the ghosts
Yeah.
that are stuck? How do you communicate?
How do you send them packing?
Yeah, how do you, yeah.
Well, you first of all, you have to convince them that they're dead, because they usually don't know it. They will say, "What do you mean I'm dead? You don't use dead. You see, you've passed over. What do you mean I passed over? I've been sick. I've been sick." They always say the same thing. I said, "No, you're not. What day is this?" And you show him a calendar or something like that to convince them that a lot of time has passed. And then comes the moment of realization. What do I do now? Where do I go? How do I, you know? And you say, you must call out to your loved ones. Say, please take me across. And they are waiting for you. All of them, they wait for you. And if you convince them that they can do this, if you convince them that they can call out to their loved ones to help them, they'll be gone. They'll be gone. And that's the way to exercise them. Not the way the church does it, of course. You know, the cross to Dracula, and Dracula says, "What do you want from me? I'm Jewish," right? Yeah. It doesn't work that way. You have to hit them where it makes sense. Yes. Then they'll go on. Ghosts are human beings. They are not monsters. They are not something set aside. Ghosts are not different from other people. They are simply somebody who has died and lost a physical body, but is now in the etheric body, but there's nowhere to go. And you got to help them to go to that side where they belong. Once you've done that, they're gone. That's how you get rid of ghosts. Yes?
If you were on the committee to decide what was going to happen at the World Trade Center site, what would you tell them? I'd be actually curious what everybody here would say.
I have already had a number of reports from people that come to me, people who are psychic, because they see them walking around there, confused, and not knowing what to do. There are a lot of lost spirits there, people who are in shock, and what can one do about it? So many of them, you cannot, it's very difficult. It's not going to go away. I mean, what should be done is that several mediums should work there and try to help them and explain to them what has happened, because most of them will not realize what has happened. But the place is as haunted as a place can be, yes.
Why wouldn't they know? You already may have explained this,
Yeah.
but everywhere you look, you see the souvenir booklets that explain what happened. So why would they not?
But I think the way they died might have prevented that. They're in a state of shock. And all I know is I got reports, people, psychic people, having seen them and walking around the area. And there's very little I can do about it, considering the number of people involved. But they are there, and they're not going to fade. You know, just doesn't go away like that. And I think a religious service isn't going to do any good either.
No.
No.
Build on it.
No.
Well, thank you very much. We need to move now to the next speaker, but let's thank Dr. Holzer. Our next speaker is Loyd Auerbach. He is the director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations in California. For over 22 years, he has been investigating cases of paranormal phenomena of all different types, helping people understand what may or what may not be going on with their lives. He's the consulting editor of Fate magazine. He's the current president of the Psychic Entertainment Association, and he's also the president of the California Society for Psychical Studies. He has a BA in Cultural Anthropology, a master's degree in Parapsychology, and he's the author of several books, such as ESP Hauntings and Poltergeist, Psychic Dreaming, Reincarnation, Channeling, and Possession, and one that you have seen out here, Mind Over Matter. Let me introduce you to Loyd Auerbach.
And actually, I went to school with Carlos many years ago, so had a nice reunion again. Don't get to see him very often. Well, let me tell you a little bit about what I've been doing, and I kind of want to talk about a few of the points that have been raised here, and tell you a couple of stories, a couple of the cases that have some really interesting veridicality. They were validated in different ways, and to some extent opened my eyes to a lot of different things over the years. First of all, I want to say that fear, because this was asked before, fear on the part of the investigator is one of the things we have to deal with, but to be very honest, I have not been in any situation where the phenomena has made me afraid, nervous, worried. I approach it with a sense of wonder. It's something that's pretty cool, actually, when something happens. However, fear is a big thing on the part of the individuals who call us in. On the other side of that, however, I have been in situations where I have been afraid, not because of the phenomena, but because of the people who call us in. Remember, ghosts don't carry guns and knives, but people can. So, when you're doing your work as an investigator, one of the things that's very clear and has been clear over the years is going on alone very often is not a good idea. And being aware of where you are and the kind of people that are calling you in is also very important. You have to know that sometimes you will, in fact, run into some situations that are difficult, and I have over the years. Another thing is that I've learned is approaching things, as Tony mentioned, with an open mind is extremely important, and probably even more so because of the fact that in any case that I've run into where there has been genuine phenomena, I've also run into overlays that the people have put, mistakes that people have made. In other words, they have seen something genuine. They've had a real experience, but because now they are afraid or overly sensitized, all of a sudden, every creak that they never noticed in their house, something falling off the wall because somebody bumped it from the other side, all the things that they never really took notice of, those become part of the case. So you not only have to look at the case as a general piece, but you have to also look at each individual event and determine whether they really are or are not part of the situation. Unless you understand what's normal, you can't figure out what the paranormal actually is. So we're trying to figure all that out. Now, over the years, when I first got into this, actually, years ago, I started out, I think my third week at JFK University in '79, doing a case. It was the first time I got involved in it. And over the years, I was involved in a variety of different pieces of paranormal research, parapsychological research and such. Actually, like Dr. Holzer, I had the whole Ghostbuster thing thrown on me because of the movie Ghostbusters. I had just happened to be in 1984 the only person on the faculty at JFK who couldn't afford to go to a parapsychology convention at the time when the media was actually doing a lot of stories on Ghostbusters. So I became the world-renowned Ghostbuster, even though that was not necessarily the case at that time. And since then, I guess I've tried to live up to that as much as I can, although busting ghosts is not exactly the right phrase. Sometimes we just simply make peace with the ghost, or sometimes understand what's going on. In 1985, I had a case that was, to me, kind of a turning point, because before that point, I had just the open mind. I had not certainly experienced anything with ghosts or hauntings personally. I had done a lot of cases at that point, but had not been involved in a case where, to my mind, it was absolutely clear that what we have is an apparition, someone. We had a person there. We actually had a spirit, whatever you want to call it. And this was a case that did not start out on the fear side. It actually started out from the perspective of a mother being concerned about how her son was growing up. A woman by the name of Pat called us at the university, at JFK University. This is back when we actually had a parapsychology program there. And her conversation with me started out, "Hi, my name's Pat. I'm a lawyer who lives in the Livermore area. That's an area just about an hour and a half east of San Francisco. I have a private practice. I'm a family attorney, been doing this for a long time. I have a 12-year-old son, and he sees a ghost every day. I want to know if it's okay for him to talk to the ghost every day as he grows up. Is he going to turn out normal?" Now that's an interesting concern for a woman, and the first thing I said to her was, "Did anybody else in the family see the ghost? Or has anyone seen the ghost?" And she said, "Yeah, we've all seen the ghost, but he's the one who's talking to her on a daily basis," and that was her concern. Well, before we actually went out there, one of the things that we were able to do at the university was refer her to a child psychologist who did in fact spend time with this 12-year-old boy. And again, before I went out there, I was able to meet with this child psychologist because of the permission of the parents to find out what the consensus was, even though since everyone else in the family had had the experience of seeing the ghost several times, as I'll get into, this was something that was genuine to the entire family. And his response was, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I've never met a better adjusted 12-year-old. Apparently, on a daily basis, according to the boy, he was talking to this woman's ghost. Her name was Lois, by the way. And Lois would give him advice on things for school. In fact, apparently was helping him with his homework from time to time. The guy was completely baffled by the fact that there was no other sign of unusual behavior on the part of this boy. And in fact, his grades were A+ in school. He was really well liked by his friends. There was absolutely nothing to pull him out of the social order, so to speak. He was normal. He said, "Too normal. I don't ever want to see this kid again. There's no need to it." So we went out. I grabbed a couple of folks to come out with me to Livermore. And I lived at that point in a town called Walnut Creek, also east of San Francisco. And it was about 40 minutes from Livermore. And I had gathered a lot of information. What I had gathered before we even went out there was that this had happened for over a year and a half. In 1983, this family bought this home. It's an old Victorian house that was built in Livermore in 1917. Now, for the area, that's fairly old. For the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, that's pretty old. Anything especially right before or after the earthquake is very old, and anything before that is ancient, as far as they're concerned, unlike the East Coast. The woman whose ghost apparently was appearing had been born in this house around the time the house had been built, just right after it had been opened by her family. She lived there her entire life. She inherited the house from her parents. She lived there her whole life. She died of cancer, actually in a hospital not too far from the house. And unfortunately, she only had one living relative when she died, who was an older gentleman who was in a retirement home. Now, the families had an attorney, and the attorney actually took care of the estate sale, selling it to Pat and her family. They bought the house. They bought significant amounts of the furniture because it was all antiques. They bought a porcelain doll collection that Lois had had in a collector's cabinet near the kitchen. From about a week after they moved in, Pat, her husband Mark, their son Chris, and Pat's mother, who was visiting at the time they moved, apparently were all spotting an older woman walking around the house and, strangely enough, waving at them. Pat was not a skeptic. Her husband Mark was, but Pat was not. In fact, her mother, as we were talking to her later on, it turns out had seen ghosts as a child herself. So they all were separately not ignoring the ghost, but just kind of acknowledging her and just moving on with their lives, not doing anything about it, and certainly not talking about it amongst themselves, because each one of them was concerned that the rest of the family would be worried about living in a haunted house. Now, a year and a half later, Pat is standing outside the kitchen talking to her son Chris, who had just gotten home from school, and Chris starts pointing at the porcelain dolls and mentions that one of them came from a particular town in Germany and starts talking about it. Then it starts talking about a second doll, and Pat said, "You know, Chris, we've been looking for documentation about stuff like this. Did you find something in the attic? Is there any?" No, Lois told me." Pat says, "Who's Lois? Is that a friend of yours from school, a teacher?" "No, Lois is the ghost, Mom. The ghost that you and Dad and Grandma are seeing but are not saying anything about." And Pat said, apparently, how do you know we're seeing the ghost? Oh, Lois told me. So apparently, again, she comes to find out through her, she said that she went into attorney mode and interrogated her son heavily. In fact, she ended up, over the next few weeks, searching his room to see if there were any diaries from Lois that had been left behind, check the house from top to bottom, even talk to some of his friends. She wanted to get to the bottom of this, for sure, even though she had had the experience herself. When we came in, it was myself and, at that time, my wife at the time, Joanna, came down with me. And one of the students who was also our receptionist at the Graduate School of Consciousness Studies at JFK, Kip Laser. And Kip had been, as we're driving down in my, at that point, fairly old car that was about to fall apart, we had a conversation. And our conversation, which will come in later as you hear in this story, was that we were going to buy a new car, and we were talking about the kind of car we were going to buy. Joanna was very upset with her job at the time, so Kip was asking her a lot of questions about quitting and what she wanted to do next. And Kip, as it turned out, was a returning adult student. I think you remember Kip? Yeah, he had been a professional dancer in Hollywood for 10 years between college and graduate school. Unusual occupation. We get to the house. We go inside and we started recording on a tape recorder from the moment we walked in. We were told, we were met actually by Pat, her mother, and Chris. The husband was out of town on a sales call, he's a salesman. And we walk around the house, start talking to them about Lois. And the first thing that Kip actually asked Chris was, is Lois with us? And Chris said, yeah, she's right behind us. Now, I should preface this next piece by saying that we had been told or asked by Pat to make sure we didn't bring the blasters with us because Lois and Chris had seen a commercial for Ghostbusters. So we had to make sure, we had to promise that we would not bring our backpacks and blasters and things like that with us. And when we got there, Chris actually went out to our car and took a look around to make sure that we did not, in fact, have any of such equipment. And I think if today we'd walked into with today's technology, we probably would have freaked out the ghost, so to speak. We walk around the house, started getting a lot of backstory about Lois. Got an awful lot of information from Chris about her history, about her life, including some family stories. She started telling us some stories, or Chris was telling us stories that he claimed Lois was telling him just walking next to us. Now, the appearance of Lois to Chris and the family was very often of an elderly woman, but as Chris and even Pat said, from time to time, Lois would appear as a young woman, as a little girl, as a middle-aged woman, and with different clothing every day. So she apparently had a closet somewhere in the house. We sat down in the living room and decided we're going to ask some more questions. And one of the things I had the opportunity to do, because this is kind of like, in some respects this was so surreal because I felt like I was in the middle of a situation comedy television program. We're all seated around a semicircle and there's an empty easy chair where Lois is sitting, according to Chris, and next to that is Chris, who is translating, apparently, what this ghost is telling him. We asked her more questions about her family, including, did she have any relatives around? That's partly how we found out, in fact, where this only living relative was, and I'll get to him in a minute. We asked questions. I wanted to know for a change, we got a ghost sitting here. Let's find out, okay, Lois, you're here, where do you get your clothes from? One of the things that had always bothered me is where do ghosts get their clothing from and how come some of them has a bad taste? She said, and this was remember, this is coming from a 12-year-old boy, so this is actually kind of an important thing also. The response was, as far as she knew, she was just a ball of light, a ball of energy. That's as far as she knew. How she pictured herself, how she thought of herself on a given day was what Chris would see in his mind's eye. In other words, she's telling us, or Chris is telling us, that Lois is telepathically informing Chris of what she looks like on a given day. And the same goes with the rest of the family. Nothing visual to be seen. This is something that's going into his head, which is how she knew she could change her clothing, because she just thought of herself differently every day. Which is kind of interesting when you think about it, because most people today in our culture and most cultures around the world, if you were to get a picture of yourself in your head, it's a rare person who would actually imagine themselves as naked. When I do lectures at colleges around the country, I usually ask that question. I have people do that, and usually there's one frat guy in the back who raises his hand when I ask how many people imagine yourselves naked. People think of themselves with clothing on. It's a self-image issue. Well, as we're sitting there, I asked other questions. Lois, why are you here? And she said, well, when she died, she didn't know where to go. She was also afraid. She had not been a very devout Christian, had not gone to church every week. In fact, some of the neighbors had complained about to her that she should really be going to church every week. So she figured she didn't know where she'd end up. She didn't know if there was a heaven or hell, had no idea. So she figured she'd stay in her house. Kind of why take a chance? We asked a few more questions about the situation. Why can't anyone else see her? And she said she didn't feel, at least, again, Chris is telling us that she didn't feel comfortable with anyone else, which is why she didn't want to be seen. In fact, she didn't trust us. We're ghost hunters. Well, we explained what we were doing there. And I eventually asked Lois, do you have any questions yourself for us? And Chris turns and looks at us and says, Lloyd, what kind of new car do you want to get? Joanna, do you really want to quit your job? And Kip, how long were you a professional dancer? And that's about how I reacted. Yeah, stunned silence. Okay, I'm thinking, they bugged my car, we talked about this, the kid's psychic, all sorts of things are going through my head at this point. And later on, we actually listened to the audio tape to make sure, in fact, we had not mentioned any of these things. And we had not mentioned any of this from the moment we walked in the house. I asked Chris, how does Lois know to ask us these questions? Is she reading our minds? Because we did, in fact, have this conversation on the drive down. And Chris looks at the chair and looks back and says, well, you're probably not going to like this, but she really didn't trust you guys. She went to Walnut Creek and got in your car and rode down with you to Livermore, listening into your conversation, making her one of those vanishing hitchhikers, I guess. Well, that was kind of an interesting scenario for me to deal with. And to follow that up, we took the information that we had been given by Chris about Lois and about her living relative. In fact, part of the information we were given was where this actual cousin was, where he physically was. We actually called this place that we were told by Chris where he was. He's 92 years old. Pat had not had this information, was not able to get it from the other attorney. We actually called the place. The guy was there. We were invited over to see him when he found out we had just visited his cousin's house. And we start telling him some of the stories we're given. He had grown up with Lois. He was a first cousin and had been around the family during a number of the events of Lois's life. And in fact, as we started a good number of our stories, he finished them. So we had a situation which really made me realize that we had two possibilities for me. One was that Chris had found an extremely detailed diary that Lois had left behind, detailed to the point where I can't imagine anybody getting up this much detail and to memorize it, or we actually had a person, an entity. Well, over the years since then, I've been following up with the family, and last time I talked to them was about a year and a half ago. This was 85. And in fact, Lois stuck around through high school. Chris apparently talked to her every day, got advice about how to deal with girls. Pat remarked that Lois apparently was helping a lot because he was very popular with girls. Still, after high school, went to college, same thing, and would come home every once in a while to speak to her. And from time to time, Pat and her mother, who's still around, see Lois walking around the house. Now, that kind of case puts you in a perspective when you're looking at these things of, what do you do with that? Okay, if these people are faking it, there's no motive. They didn't want publicity. This was not something that anyone in the family even needed to talk about to their friends. There was no motivation, and that is one of the things we look at. In other situations I've dealt with, sometimes you get up mixed cases of different types. Now, it's been mentioned that you have to be walking with an open mind. The fact is you do find, not necessarily fraud, but as Tony mentioned, people make mistakes. People make mistakes a lot because of the frame of mind that they're actually in. One of the situations that we often check out is what kinds of books these folks have in their house. I've walked into situations where there's stacks and stacks of the Weekly World News with famed psychic's head explodes on top of the headline. Some people are very credulous, and other people read that stuff because they like it and it's funny. But we have people who just simply fall into the trap of thinking something is paranormal because they can't find an explanation, and we have to look for them. I had one case where it turned out that the footsteps that they were hearing from their attic was actually a squirrel rolling walnuts across a very rough attic floor, and the acoustics were such that the noise sounded like footsteps. I know this because I staked out the attic and surprised a squirrel by flicking on a flashlight in the dark at 11 o'clock at night. It was kind of spooky. Actually, I was a little freaked out when I saw a squirrel making the sounds than anything else. But I did have a case a few years ago that was kind of a mixed situation. Dr. Holzer mentioned imprints, and that's something I do run into very, very often, in fact, that places seem to hold information. In this one case that we had two things being reported to us, one of which was that a house that a couple of stockbrokers from New York who had just moved to Marin County had bought had certain spots in it that felt really bad. There was a spot in the backyard, one of the bedrooms upstairs, and the garage. Felt bad. You walk in, you could barely breathe to these rooms. Also, separately, and they knew it was separate, they told us it was separate, they reported that there was a little girl who would show up and even play with their 2-year-old and 4-year-old, and then she'd disappear. She would follow Janet around and would even get in the car and then just vanish as they're driving away. So 2 different things happening. We got to the house, a large group of us, and actually spent several trips to this house, and it turns out that the feelings that people were getting were genuine. In fact, without even telling us what bedroom it was, what part of the garage, or what part of the backyard, all 6 of us on the team, none of whom were particularly psychic, walked around and marked down where we thought these spots were, and we all hit the same spots. We then brought in a psychic on a second trip who also got the same spots without being told anything about the fact other than that there was a spot or 2 in the house and around the house that was unusual. We found out, among other things, this house, which was about 80 years old, had, prior to this woman, this couple owning it, belonged to an attorney in the Marin area who, according to the sheriff's department, was more than a shady character. In fact, they were pretty sure he was a weapons dealer and a drug dealer. They were convinced that he was moving guns in boxes in and out of the garage. And in fact, the psychic we had brought in, the second trip, she reported to us that she saw boxes with weapons being moved in and out of the garage. And this is before, again, we talked to the sheriff's department. The house also in the 70s had been a bordello. And several people died in the house, murdered, one of whom was knifed outside the house. As it turns out, the police figured out, they found the body approximately where we actually picked up the spot in the backyard. And the spot in the bedroom upstairs, someone else had died up there too, been murdered up there during this whole period of time. So not a very nice house in that sense. Little girl's ghost was unusual. Between the first and second visit, Janet found some old photographs wedged in behind a radiator. That looked like one of them looked like a little girl. There actually was 2 little girls there. Turns out these are the daughters of the original builders of the house, one of 2 Scottish brothers who had built 2 homes in the neighborhood. The other home was still owned by the family up the street. As it turns out, we got into this a little bit more, one of the daughters is still alive. She's in her 90s. She actually was in and out of consciousness quite a bit. She was living with her relatives up the street and had a full-time nurse. And the nurse actually, as she's cataloging when the woman's conscious and not, the times that the ghost was seen down the street were in fact the same times the woman was unconscious. She would often, according to the nurse, wake up and talk about visiting the nice lady who looked like her mother down the street at her old home. And in fact, when we showed the pictures to the woman when she was conscious, it turned out that the little girl who was seen as the ghost was this woman who was up the street. She reported having an out-of-body experience during her dreams and visiting this family, described the new family to a T, a case of a living apparition in this particular instance. So we run into some very unusual situations. In some respects, as we're getting into this, and as I have gotten to over the years, there have been many, many different ways we've dealt with the phenomena, but most of the time we try to deal with people's emotions, the living people, and dealing with how they can actually live with what's happening, if that is something that will work for them. We have actually come up with different methodologies to help get rid of the ghosts, which seem to be mostly, like Dr. Holzer said, talking to the ghosts. Although sometimes, this is apparently one of the things that's made into the media for me, I've been reported as using rap music to get rid of ghosts as well. Actually, country seems to work a little bit better than rap music, but it depends on where you're from, I think. I'm just saying that kiddingly. The issue that was asked before was also an issue about invasion of privacy, and in fact, people do report that quite often, that they're not so much afraid necessarily of the ghosts as the ghost is invading their privacy. And there are different ways we've actually helped counsel the folks or refer them to counseling for all of this. But what I've learned over the years is that you can't make people believe in this phenomenon. They either do or they don't, or they have an experience. Let me close by saying that I'm involved in a case on and off for the last couple of years with an aircraft carrier. It's the USS Hornet Museum. It's a World War II carrier. It's been on television since probably 1999 when we first did the investigation. They have over 50 different reported individuals, officers and sailors. And apparently, and these are being reported by dozens of witnesses, many of whom are docents working for the ship, who served aboard that ship or other ships during World War II, in fact. That some of them recognize their buddies from that time period and has reportedly had conversations with Admiral J.J. Clark, who died not on the ship, but after that, and has apparently retired back to the ship. In fact, the spirit, so to speak, of the folks working there has been, with the exception of a couple of board members who are preventing us currently from doing any more investigations because they don't like the idea of ghosts on the ship. But the spirit is generally a very positive one, where these guys feel that the ghosts are there coming back to give the ship more energy, so to speak, to kind of make it more, it's kind of hard, ghosts are making it more lively. Kind of an odd thing to say, but that's what they're telling us, and that they seem to feel, again, these are the witnesses, they seem to feel more and more of these sailors who are dying now, since they're old enough, who served aboard the ship during World War II, are actually retiring after death to this place that had such great memories for them during life. The witnesses are, like I said, some of them served aboard the ship during World War II, and when you ask them whether, why the ghosts are there, they said, well, for the same reason I'm here as a docent, because it was one of the best times of my life. I want to be back here. We are fortunate in this situation when we do go aboard the ship to have a variety of people, more and more individuals, just average people we can walk through the ship who can pick out the spots and even have experiences while on the ship. And I've even had my own experience of being patted on the back, apparently right after I said something really good to a television crew, by nobody. So as you get into this, you also kind of pay attention to the things that happen around you. The idea of ghosts and hauntings are an exciting one because it really does say something about who we are as human beings. We have a tie to the environment that's bigger than ourselves, and we are able to think of ourselves as more than just this body. There is more to us than we think. We just have to kind of expand our thinking, and perhaps even some of the ways that they have in science fiction just kind of blow ourselves out of proportion and say that we can come back or stick around as some of those mind aliens from Star Trek. We have the ability to tie into the Force, so to speak. Thank you very much, and I'll take some questions.
Have you ever contacted anyone who knew Lois when she was alive and then talked to them?
Yes, as I said, we did contact this 92-year-old cousin of hers based on the information, in fact, we got from the boy from Lois, and he did, in fact, verify the stories about Lois, so the family stories. Yes?
Did she ever leave?
Did she ever leave? Well, when I talked to Pat a year and a half ago, she said that she had just seen her about a week before. So Pat, actually, the family likes the house. It's a great house, and so she stayed there for all this time.
Did you try to use the usual story, go to the light, talk about this like
did I try to use, the idea of getting rid of a ghost, what if they don't want to go? In this case, it was an issue where there seemed to be pretty good relationship between the family and the ostensible ghost, the apparition. And so in this case, we didn't want to bust the ghosts. We did ask her if she felt like she needed to move on, and we would try to help her do that, and the response was basically, she likes the family, they like her, why leave? Again, of course, this is coming from the 12-year-old, so maybe the 12-year-old wanted to keep her around and made that part up. Hard to know.
Do you ever deal with anything that's evil or malevolent?
Do I ever deal with anything that's evil or malevolent? Well, first of all, let me say my background in anthropology taught me one important thing, is that label, those two labels, are placed on activities of human beings by other human beings. You don't think of predators in the wild as being evil, but they're bad. I mean, they may do bad things. Human beings are above the whole instinctual thing for the most part. So yeah, there are people who do bad things, but I've never actually, I can't say I've never met a ghost I didn't like, but I can say that all the reports that we've had, the worst we've had is since they can't really hurt you, this stuff cannot hurt you, except on a psychological level, and it's your reaction. The worst we've ever had is a ghost who was so insulting, so annoying, so hostile, verbally abusive, that was seen as evil. But how many of us don't know? We all know people like that here in New York, especially, and now a lot in California too, for that matter. So I mean, it's an overlay that you put on these things, and we haven't had ghosts of criminals, mass murderers. Don't see that happening, but the imprints do linger on. Some of the imprints are actually there. Yes.
I just had a question. I don't mean to be rude, but is that just from your point of view because it's never actually happened to you, or studies that you don't believe that's possible?
I will say that a good part of that is from my own perspective about the evil issue. Part of it has to do with my background in anthropology and looking at different cultures. About the ability to harm you? That is, the ability to harm you of a ghost is partly my point of view, but also it comes from a lot of years of looking at cases that have been written up in various journals. History, I have to say thank God for eBay, because I have, although I don't know if my wife really likes this, but I go on eBay quite a bit and buy a lot of the old books. And I go through a lot of the cases from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I've gone to a lot of different cultural backgrounds. Because I have a pretty good library on spirits and ghosts around the world, I looked at that as well. I've talked to a number of mediums, a number of psychics who have worked with these sorts of things. And it does seem to be that the way, if you want to talk about harm, the way people get hurt, because people do in fact get hurt in these cases, is their fear runs away with them. They can cause things to happen to themselves. I had one case where a woman literally believed that something was choking her, and I saw her throat bulge out and finger marks appear on her throat. I saw that. But there was no ghost. As we learned, it was actually her own mind causing this to happen to herself because of the childhood trauma. No ghost there. It was not really that kind of case. We've had cases where the apparition scares people enough that they do in fact say that they were hurt. And in fact they were hurt. It's a traumatic experience. So from that perspective they can. And I've had cases where there appears to be an intelligent apparition, intelligent entity, and things move around. But those things that move around don't get thrown at people. And even in the poltergeist cases where people have gotten hurt, when you dig into these cases, it's typically because those folks have ducked into the path of a flying object. Try to avoid it. You know, that's the advice I give people. So this is my experience. I've talked to a number of other investigators and a lot of other parapsychologists over the years, and it doesn't seem to be the case that once you get past what's been reported, that actually what is happening is that the ghost is intentionally able, and they might want to, but they're not intentionally able to hurt somebody. Michael.
Lloyd, have you ever physically reported any of the alleged drops in temperature or noises that are supposedly occurring in the vicinity?
Have we ever physically recorded? We have actually physically recorded a number of environmental changes. In one case I did in Florida, in fact, with that same Japanese medium that Tony mentioned, Aiko Gibo, we were at a house in Archer, Florida, and we actually have on video through a thermal vision camera a drop in temperature of 22 degrees. In the middle of July in Florida with no air conditioning in central Florida. The room was measured at 97 degrees. It dropped, this one room dropped to 75 degrees. No air conditioning, no ceiling fans. That's the only room that changed. And in fact, the next room, this is the more interesting thing, increased its heat to 110 degrees. So we actually had a heat transfer happening at a time when Mrs. Gibo was speaking to a little girl's ghost. At least that's what she was reporting. The night before, we had had significant activity on several different magnetic frequencies. We actually had Mrs. Gibo again talking to this little girl's ghost. We were able to get on thermal vision camera some unusual heat spots in midair. At the same time, we're getting unusual electromagnetic activity. At the same time, a geomagnetic sensor went off the charts. At the same time that a microwave detector went off. And at the same time, a Geiger counter went off. The Geiger counter is the one that worried us. As we went back over the tapes, the videotapes, it turns out at that moment, we also got what sounded like the scream of a little girl on the videotape. So, I mean, this is a situation where we had a lot of stuff happening. Whether you believe there was a ghost there or not, we had an environmental anomaly that was certainly something that would spook anybody under other circumstances. And we have in other cases gotten things like that. Yeah.
I've also lived in the Bay Area for a long time. I was wondering if you had any experience with the most famous of the Bay Area hauntings, the Moss Beach Distillery.
Well, actually, if you go to my website, www.mindreader.com/distillery, there's a whole story about that. I've been working with the distillery for over 10 years. And the Blue Lady, or Kate as we have come to know her, people have reported seeing this ghost since the 1930s, having experience of moving objects, and we've actually had a variety of physical things we've even recorded. In fact, the first time I met Mrs. Gibo, we went to the Moss Beach Distillery, and we got a door swinging open just on its own, by itself, and we checked every 5 or 6, it was actually 6 times, with Mrs. Gibo saying, okay, she's going to open the door. Okay, she's opening it, and the door would pop open. So we've had a variety of things with different psychics, with different technology, with different witnesses over the years, and I've even had my own experience of encountering the ghosts, which I can talk about later. So.
What's that website again?
Mindreader.com is my website. It's got a lot of stories. There's an extensive page on the Moss Beach Distillery there. Okay, one more question? We got time? Yeah.
Have you ever investigated any cases of demonic possession, such as exorcists?
I have not even had a case reported to me that I would consider possession. I've never had one reported to me, so I can't comment from personal experience. I'll tell you, my personal belief system is that there are no demons other than the ones we create for ourselves. We have our own monsters from the id, to use a phrase from Forbidden Planet, but I don't buy into that, and that's partly because of my religious upbringing, as little as it was, being Jewish, and also partly because of my anthropological studies over the years. So I just have run into situations where people have hurt themselves more. Okay, thank you very much.
We have reached the end of our presentations, and now we have a general discussion, question and answer session. Feel free to address any of the speakers on any topic that they have talked about, or anything that is generally related to the topic of hauntings and ghosts. So if anyone has a question, we can just start.
All of you guys have worked with this stuff for a long time now.
Right.
I'm curious if, because you've worked with this for such a long time, if you've seen any development in your own latent abilities. I mean, working with this stuff day in and day out, does it rub off?
Well, if you're going to find nearest the microphone, I'm still hoping that I'm going to understand what I'm trying to find. I've been at it a long time. I'm still convinced that there's something there that needs explaining. Whether I'm going about it the right way, I don't know. I'm not getting the kind of results that I would like to get, so maybe I'm not going about it the right way. But you know the old saying, because it's there. People say, why do you keep on doing it, Tony? Because it's there, and because it's something that we still yet, I think, do not fully understand. Mm-hmm. And I've started this journey and I shall continue to do it. Whether I shall enlighten us in my investigations or not remains to be seen.
But you'll come back and tell us, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the point.
Yeah.
No, you've raised a point here. When people talk about death, after death, I'm afraid I'm not too much of a believer. So I put it this way. I say that when I die, and when I get over there, if I find that there's nothing in it at all, I'll come back and tell you so. Which I think sums up the situation we have.
Thank you.
I actually have noticed over the years being more sensitive to these things, but also I've been more sensitive to noticing unusual things in the environment in general, and that's partly because I've been working with a lot of, I've used psychics quite a bit in the investigations I've done. It's kind of, I use them as a tool, like a detector of some kind, and that's to me what they are in this sense. But I've also noticed that I've been picking up a lot of the same stuff before they have or at the same time they have without voicing that at all. And I tend not to in an investigation actually voice any of that, because I want to make sure that the other folks around me are getting what they need to be getting and the witnesses are explaining what they need to be explaining. I haven't still seen a ghost, but I've had my own personal encounters of other sensations, you might say, and these sorts of things. And I've certainly experienced the imprint type of phenomena, and I've certainly seen things moving around that were physical that everybody in the room saw, that we were able to deal with, and even we got in videotape of a couple of instances. So just the more I'm around it, more fun I'm having with it.
Yeah.
Can I come back before Doctor? He's raised a point too. I've been with people who've seen an apparition, and I haven't seen it. And this raises a question, why are they more sensitive than I? It's another thing, rather like you. I've never seen a ghost yet, but I don't for 1 minute think or doubt that the people who've seen the ghost won't actually see it. They do exist. Just because I can't see it doesn't mean to say that it doesn't exist. It's a challenge if you're there and somebody else is seeing it and you're not. Why not?
I don't expect it, but I'm a psychic as everybody without being a psychic or medium. I remember in Dublin, I was looking at a house that I'd heard had been haunted, and I knew nothing about it. But when I approached the house, it was a sort of a cottage. I heard people in there arguing about arguing about a will. And when I opened the door, there was nobody there. Turned out afterwards that there had been a will fight, and I had walked into a replay from the past. And that's about as psychic as you can get. Yes.
Thank you.
I have a question for all three of you. You might have a comment. I'm wondering if any of you have a thought that there's something about the way we live today, the current lifestyle, the noise, the distractions, the gadgets that fill our lives, all of these things. I wonder if this might account for a decline in sensitivity to these agencies, presences, phenomena, whatever you want to call them. My guess, because I think that Tony said something about that he felt there was a decline in the reports, and I'm wondering if there's a connection between the way we live and the general character of our culture.
If you read the early reports, you'll see that most of the good reports were, I was sitting quietly in a chair, or I was tending the garden. There was no noise, there was no distraction. As you say today, we're either looking at a computer, we're flying an aeroplane, there's a noise outside, we're on the telephone, we're busy all the time. Perhaps we're not getting ourselves into that same state that people used to get in when they saw these things. I think you more or less take that.
Yeah,
right,
I think we have so many distractions. I actually worked on a show for the Travel Channel last year. They wanted to do a show on haunted Las Vegas, and I said to the director, "You're kidding, right? You could have 50,000 ghosts walking around Las Vegas, and with so many distractions, nobody would notice. You couldn't. They all look like Elvis. So I mean, how could you notice?" It's an issue of there are so many things even happening physically around us that we don't notice. The idea of things happening psychically around us that may not be even as loud or visual as the physical stuff happening makes it difficult for us to attend to those things.
I did an experiment with undergraduates years ago. We decided that we put on a ghost. Now, normally a ghost, as you know, looks like a normal human being. So we had to follow the usual game of putting a white sheet on it. Made these undergraduates walk along a particular line, then put their hand behind them, pull it away, and they disappeared. There were 54 people walking round, the backs didn't take the slightest bit of notice. Not a bit of notice. We then thought, okay, we'll put it in a cinema in front of people. And during the ex-trailer film, I'm only very short, so we built my head up, we had this white sheet over me, and I walked across the screen one way and walked back the next. And 60% of the audience didn't see me. So perhaps the ghosts are all around us and we're not taking much notice.
I think if a spirit wants to manifest, they'll pay no attention to anything else, and they'll get through. Because at their level, they don't even hear that distraction. You know, it doesn't affect them.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
I wanted to ask you, gentlemen, about any personal experiences you may have had with friends or relatives who have passed.
I got to know, in 1992, I got to know a gentleman by the name of Martin Caden. Marty was a science fiction writer and science writer who wrote, among other things, the book Cyborg, which became the $6 Million Man. Heavily involved in the space program, real science nut. And the first time I met him was at a press conference for a conference in the Midwest, and he stated emphatically, "Tonight I will move objects with my mind." And he did. And over a few years after that, I actually worked with him on some PK work, and he had written a book called Ghosts of the Air, which talked about pilots' experience with ghosts, and I met a number of his buddies who had experiences on this. He died of cancer in March of 1997, and I had expected his ghost to show. I mean, this is a guy who was very bullheaded, very powerful kind of personality. Nothing for a week and a half goes by, and I'm driving to the Oakland airport from my home, 7 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden my fairly new car, it was about 3 months old, fills up with a smell of really stinky cigar smoke. And I immediately associated that mentally with Marty's cigars, because that smelled just like them. And I also felt like somebody was sitting next to me. So for 5 minutes I'm driving down the freeway. People are probably thinking I'm singing because my mouth is moving, and I'm saying goodbye to this guy. And I had no idea it was him, but that's what I felt. I got to Portland, Oregon that morning, made a phone call to one of Marty's friends in New Jersey, who was a pilot who I actually knew, and I got him on the phone and I said, Bob, it's Loyd Auerbach. He said, I can't believe you're calling me. I was about to call you. I said, well, I'm not home. What's going on? He said, I was up flying my Cessna, and at about 10:10 this morning, my plane cockpit filled up with the smell of Caden's cigar smoke. That's not the best part, he says to me. He says, I spoke to, and he mentioned another pilot's name down in Florida, who was up flying his plane. About 10:20, his cockpit filled up with the smell of cigar smoke. Now, this is East Coast time. This is like 10 minutes after my experience and another 10 minutes after that. So, it was kind of a powerful experience, and my last comment to Bob was, how come it took him a week and a half? And he said, well, he had a lot of friends around the world, and obviously we were lower on the list. That kind of hurt, but, that's my only experience there.
I've had nothing like that. I would have liked to have had it, but nothing. I'm still waiting for my mother to come back. She would have done, I think, if she could. My father certainly wouldn't. But my mother, on one or two occasions, when I was sort of having slight difference of opinion with her, would say, you wait, I will come back.
It'll be at a time you really least expect it. And would rather not see her.
Probably.
Any other question?
There's a perception that there are some areas on the planet which are more haunted than others. Generally, Great Britain is considered to be more haunted than the U.S. In America, people consider Gettysburg to be a very haunted piece of geography. Amongst the three of you and your experiences around the world, have you noticed that to be reality, or is it just areas that are reported more?
Well, in agreement with what Dr. Holzer said about imprints, I think that places with more history are more likely to be haunted in that sense, not necessarily because of geophysical activity. Some of the studies of geomagnetics seem to indicate that fluctuations in the magnetic field on a local level could affect people's psychic perceptions, and perhaps that's what's going on. It's hard to know whether pumping up the energy is going to make people more psychic and perceptive or less, whether it gives energy to that imprint if that's what's going on. In other words, it may actually power the VCR that allows you to see what's going on. It's hard to say what's exactly going on environmentally that allows people to see these things, or why certain events are recorded into the environment and others don't seem to play back constantly. I haven't seen anything with regards to ghost or apparition cases that relates to that directly, but it's kind of, right now we're still learning more and more about how magnetism and electromagnetism and geomagnetism affect the human brain, affect behavior in general. It was only 1994 that Caltech even found magnetic particles in our brain tissue, which is something that's still being denounced by some of the skeptics. So there's a connection we have to the magnetic environment, but what that actually means we don't know yet. We can't come to that kind of conclusion as yet. But it seems to be involved somehow, I think, in some of these imprints.
I think the idea of certain places being more haunted than others is the invention of the tourist board, and has no real truth. Whatever seems to them to be saleable is stressed, and what isn't, isn't.
I'm not happy with the geomagnetic theory because geomagnetism, when we have the alterations of particles coming from the sun, affect the whole of the magnetic sphere of the Earth.
Yeah.
And to me, it's too general. It's not localized. I mean, a small country like England, for instance, the geomagnetic variation can probably cover the whole of it, if not half of it. Now, if there's a geomagnetic effect in that respect that causes, as Persinger, I think, suggests, that if it's high, you get apparitions. If it's low, I don't know if I got it the right way around, you get poltergeist effect. We've checked some of his work, and we're not exactly happy with what he has to say. He might be right, but the way he presents it, we're not happy. And not only that, from my personal point of view, I should have thought that it should have affected a lot more people than it does. If it's covering a large area of the country, then perhaps more people should be seeing apparitions than are reported. That's that one. But on the other hand, I think we must have a look at the possible effect of geomagnetic effects, because there's some interesting results coming from stuff you said, and also one or two cases we've had in England suggest that there are localized magnetic variations. I'm not happy with it, but on the other hand, we still don't understand the effects of apparitions. We don't know how they occur fully. There are some theories, okay, but I think it was looking at in much greater detail. That's what I can say.
Yeah, I actually did a case a few years ago using a magnetometer, and we were able to, the couple saw a woman's apparition, saw a figure, and they were pointing to where she was moving, and we actually literally followed a moving magnetic field around the house. When I talked to a very skeptical physicist about this, now this field was about 3 foot off the ground and went to another 3 foot high, and it was vaguely spherical. This physicist I spoke to said there is nothing he knew of that could have caused this kind of effect to be measured, especially on a moving level. And he felt that if there were ghosts, in this case, the magnetic field probably wasn't the ghost, but more like the wake the ghost left in the magnetic environment. Since those magnetometers measure change and shifts, he said that you have somebody walking through, it's like walking through water and leaving a wake behind you, that you're actually measuring the trail, so to speak. And it's interesting because in some respects, when I thought back at that point about what we measured, we were measuring a couple feet behind where they were pointing. So we're kind of following something. Now, he might have been right, he might have been wrong, but it could have been, who knows what it was. It could have been leprechaun, I don't know. But this is one of those cases, and we've had other cases like that, where we've had moving magnetic anomalies in interactive cases. We have static magnetic anomalies in the imprint cases. We don't know why they're being caused. Some of them are on the geomagnetic frequency, some of them are not. It's just that some of them are all frequency levels. We don't know what's going on with that. And the weirdest thing is the ability to disrupt them, because we've had that case I mentioned with the living apparition. The psychic I work with disrupted the magnetic field in those three places on the property that had this feeling. She did something visualization in her head, and the measurement was gone, just plain gone. We've actually disrupted it using a bulk tape eraser that you can buy at Radio Shack. It's gone. We have no idea why it was there to begin with. We have no idea why it's gone. Maybe it's a placebo on our part. I don't know, but we were waving around the earth, the salt, and the whole thing in some respects that Tony talked about. But the measurement was simply gone by doing something that makes sense in some weird way. So I don't know what we were actually even getting at that point.
I think it wants further looking at, I must say. There seems to be evidence this side of the Atlantic and also the other side. And it's no good just poo-pooing it. I mean, we've all got to try and look at various methods and explanations, and this is one I think that needs following up. What I do not agree with, I did mention it rather briefly, was one of our very eminent, if you like, researchers who goes to a case and he thinks that there's nothing in it at all, and I'm talking about Richard Wiseman, bless his heart, who I know very well, came out with a theory, having looked at ghosts in Edinburgh, and surprised us all by telling us that the Edinburgh Castle complex is one of the most haunted places in England. A good few of us didn't know that. We know it now. And they've come to the conclusion that, or he's come to the conclusion, that if you generate electrical currents, then you will make people see ghosts. Well, we know that if you fool around with magnetometers near the brain, you can produce peculiar effects in the brain. I mean, experiments like that have been done. But I think he's trying to make it a little bit too simple, for the simple reason that there were no electrical mains around, as I said earlier, in Greek and Roman days, and they were seeing ghosts, so I don't think that that's got anything to do with it. But the suggestions you're making, I certainly think need following up.
We get a lot of calls at the Foundation for amateur ghost investigators, and in light of all your expertise, I was wondering if you have a few words of advice for the amateur as they set off on their ghost investigations.
I should say that Dr. Holzer, I met Dr. Holzer when I was in high school, and he gave me advice to become a parapsychologist. So,
well,
sorry.
Try to be as scientific as you can. Ask questions, ask for witnesses, and if there's something to it, then come back with a medium. Nothing works without a medium. That's my advice.
I guess my advice would be to actually ask a lot of questions, to walk in with that open mind, to not be satisfied with one reading, because too many of the amateurs actually are satisfied with just getting a nice reading on their magnetometer without figuring out that it's actually the coffee machine in the next room.
Right.
Because I've seen that happen. And not be satisfied with the spirit of the photos. I think that in one respect, if you don't have living witnesses, you can pretty much get unusual readings on any of your equipment anywhere if you really want to. But it's got to dovetail or connect to a human experience, because it's by human experience we're defining these very things that we're talking about today. Without human beings, we've got nothing. That's how we define consciousness itself, which is an interesting thing in of itself. There's a lot of research going on in California on consciousness, and it connects a lot to this. And it's just interesting that consciousness is the only thing that tries to measure itself. So without that measurement of itself, the experience of knowing itself and knowing the experience, you just have a bunch of anomalous readings in the environment. That's all you have. So the reliance on technology is the thing that I'd say that people need to watch out for. And I actually think that bringing in sensitives and psychics can help, because you're bringing in potentially other witnesses who can verify the people's experience. I think it's vital to do that.
I'm going to look at the question another way. I think what you're asking is, should people continue to be amateurs rather than become professional parapsychologists? Well, there's a place for both, I think. The only problem that we've come across in the Society for Psychical Research when we're giving out grants, and also the experience that we've had in Cambridge amongst one or two professional parapsychologists, are that there is a great temptation perhaps, I emphasize, perhaps, to exaggerate your results, because if you don't exaggerate results, you're not going to get results in the laboratory by the look of it. And if you don't get results, you're not going to get grants. And if you don't get grants, you can't carry on as a professional parapsychologist. It's a very great problem. We had one gentleman who was well known in the field at the time, and I'm not going to mention his name, it would be wrong to do so because it's all over and done with. But he was in Cambridge University, the psychology part of it, doing parapsychological work, and very good work. He's getting exceptionally good results, much higher results than anybody else. And we were worried about this. In fact, we were asked by one or two quite prominent American parapsychologists to look into his work. And we looked into it because the results were so consistent that they didn't tie up with anybody else's. Frankly, we couldn't find anything wrong with his work. His randomization procedure was perfectly all right. But there is that temptation, and I think there is the place for the amateur. But of course, in this field, it really is so controversial that can you say that anybody who's interested in this is a true amateur? You've got to have a knowledge of science. You've got to have a knowledge of human nature. Basically, I think what you need more than anything else is common sense. The amateur also, I think, can in a way stand back and look at it all. He's not committed to it. The parapsychologist professional is committed to it. And if he doesn't get results, there's no living. And there isn't a great deal of money about either this side of the Atlantic or the other side of the Atlantic these days for professional work. I mean, Bob Morris in Edinburgh is doing quite well, but he's always got financial problems. We know those. I know Bob extremely well. The SPR in London has got financial problems. I know that the American SPR has got financial problems. In Europe, there isn't the kind of money being put into the subject. So there is a place for the amateur. But the amateur must, I think, be very careful in the way he approaches it. He's got to have, as you said, and we've all said, an open mind. He's got to have a knowledge of science, he's got to have a knowledge of human beings, and he's got to be very careful with his results. He should read up all the background. There's a wealth of material in various libraries that he should read and see what people have done in the past and follow their line. So I'm all for the amateur, but an amateur that has to be careful with what he does.
At the very least, read something about parapsychology, because so many of the amateurs I get emails from, they get all their information from other amateur groups on the internet. and it's very frightening. They don't even, some of them don't even know anything about research in parapsychology. They know nothing about what's gone on before in ghost investigations, nothing whatsoever. They haven't even read Dr. Holzer's books, which I find, frankly, that's kind of bizarre, because Dr. Holzer's books are easy to find. They're very easy to find, and they're very good books. So it worries me significantly when I find that happening.
This closes the discussion period. And now, to finish the activities of today, our Executive Director, Lisette Colley, is going to have some final comments. Thanks.
Well, it's my task to very unhappily bring this forum to a close. I would very much like to thank our speakers, Tony Cornell, Dr. Hans Holzer and Loyd Auerbach, and of course our moderator, Dr. Alvarado, who shared with us so eloquently, I'm sure you'll agree, their expertise in this fascinating area. Admittedly, ghosts and hauntings is an area rife with misconceptions and misinformation. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's very satisfying to realize that despite what the media brings us, there are clear heads and compassionate individuals who strive to come to some sense of the phenomena which historically has puzzled mankind, continues, and most probably will continue to puzzle us. But as we have all experienced here today, with critical thinking and scientific methodology, we will undoubtedly eventually reach the answers we seek. And until then, Parapsychology Foundation stands ever ready to assist one and all in your continued investigations into the paranormal.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed today's selection. My name is Lisette Colley and I serve as president of Parapsychology Foundation. I hope you give us a like, and if you have a comment, then do so below and we'll try and better serve you. Any suggestions are welcome. And we want to thank very much our loyal subscribers. This is a relatively new channel and a new venture for Parapsychology Foundation, so we very much appreciate your loyalty. And if you haven't decided to subscribe, maybe pretty please you could. So